more interesting to me is they had completely missed the way to frame the question, because they assumed that the way we read Wikipedia is the same way we read Britannica. And we don't. Those of the digital age that are kind of net literate, and we hear Jerry talk more about this later, kind of recognize that when you read Wikipedia, what do? You look at the edit stream. You look at the rollbacks. You see what's being contested. Wikipedia, unlike Britannica, shows what's being contested still. And you can look at what's being contested and decide for yourself, do you want to accept this or not? If it's not being contested at all in the edits and rollbacks, you know that part has been basically bought into by everybody. And so basically the reading practices for how do you read something like Wikipedia are completely different than the way I read Britannica. In Britannica, I assume there are institutional warrants behind what I read. Here, basically, the peer review process is open, not closed. Everybody gets to see that. If you do not know how to read Wikipedia, you will be misled, nature's result notwithstanding. But if you understand it, you kind of get it, and you get actually a much deeper insight into what's going on, what's being debated, what the debates are, and so on and so forth. Just a small example of kind of in this world of constant change, new types of reading practices, new genres, if you wish, and so on. Let's go on. What about learning? Because obviously if the world is actually exponentially changing all this time, how are we going to feel comfortable with that? The roles of schools make any sense anymore? That train us with an inventory of skills that we can deploy supposedly for our life. Let's look at learning more. You know, most of our learning institutions today, in terms of schools, are based on a Cartesian view of learning. Basically, I think, therefore I am, is an individual act, knowledge is a substance. Pedagogy has to do with how do you optimize the transfer of knowledge into my head. And there's some very deep work, obviously, going on in terms of pedagogies to expedite that, if you wish, that transfer. In fact, but if you take this kind of Cartesian point of view, it leads us to thinking about learning, as I just said, in terms of the pouring of knowledge into my head. And if you move up the scale ways to the universities, or let alone the graduate school level, what do you find is we think of learning in terms of knowledge fitting to these perfectly aligned rows, all separated. And I learned this discipline, or this specialty, or this specialty, and this specialty. They don't cross-cut. And so we cultivate neat rows of disciplinary knowledge. I wanted to show you a movie, and we're going to show it in one of the breaks. This is picking up, in fact, in some of the kinds of methodologies that Patrick's group here has pioneered, a digital and physical ethnography done by 200 students at Kansas State, looking at their view of learning and just how much at odds that is with the lecture halls that they are actually asked to sit in. It's a 4.2-minute film. We'll show it at some break. Interesting to me that this is on YouTube. You can go to YouTube. It's done by Michael Wesch's group. This particular YouTube, when I pulled this off, actually I pulled this off about 9 months ago, at that point had been viewed over 2 million times. This says something. And it is an ethnography that's also been rendered as a visual argument. These kids not only did the ethnography work, but then they asked, how do I report this in terms of a visual argument? And think about it. What constitutes a visual argument? So you see an ethnography and you see a visual argument, all wrapped up in this amazing 4-minute type video. But if you step back and you think about the 21st century, actually you might think about it at any time, I think many of us have come to the view that this Cartesian view of learning has really misled us, and we want to look at more of what I'm going to call a very simple notion, a social view of learning. Instead of I think, therefore I am, maybe even in a deep psychoanalytic way, we participate with each other, and through that participation, we come into being. We participate, therefore we are. Not this lone genius idea, but the fact that almost everything we do with others, and we learn from others. In fact, I want to argue that almost all our understanding is socially constructed. That is not saying that knowledge is socially constructed at all. This is not a postmodern argument, but this is an argument that says the way I take what I've been told or that I have discovered and internalize it has an awful lot to do with the kinds of conversations I have with my peers around us. In fact, from this kind of social view of learning, it really suggests we look at learning more like this. We learn in and through our interactions with the world and with others. Oh, good, we got good focus finally. And this is not too surprising. There turns out to be a lot of studies done in education, but very few of them are really replicatable that much. There happens to be one major result that has been replicated time and time again. And that's to say that there's no better predictor of how well you're going to do in college than your ability to understand how to create or join study groups. Because it is in study groups that you actually transform what you've learned in the textbook or what you've picked up in the classrooms or the lecture halls, and you then begin to personalize that, integrate that into your being, and so on and so forth. So the ability to do this, to be able to join these study groups, form these study groups, is critical. And some of us have actually studied this quite a bit, and we've discovered the very interesting result, although intuitively known by most of the digital kids today, is that these study groups, by the way, work virtually just as well as they do face-to-face, especially if you know each other to begin with. And this says that instant messaging, et cetera, Second Life, are all kinds of examples of this. In fact, there's kind of a caricature of this, is we begin to see that we can create a space, a virtual space, where these study groups really do kind of start to work out very, very well. And in fact, one of the most kind of extreme examples of this comes out of Australia. Here is a study group in actually Second Life. I won't take you through all the details of the space, but these people are spread out all over the place. They're very interesting ways to be able to have your own little discussion groups. The instructor, if you want, can call all these distributed tables back together to be able to have a group discussion amongst all the small groups going on and so on and so forth. It's just beginning to scratch the surface of the ways that we can use technology to support these types of study groups. But we can go further, because we have to now step back and ask, if things like these study groups and learning with and from each other are so important, maybe we got to step back and look at more fundamental participatory architectures and the ways that technology can actually create new media, new mediums, in order to kind of facilitate this type of learning. And of course the answer, as everyone in this room knows, is obviously it is. I mean, the Web 2.0 world is a new kind of participatory medium. And that new type of participatory medium could absolutely change the game in terms of education. Let me give you one example. I was at the University of Michigan a little while ago, and the vice provost came up to me, a colleague that I worked with for many years, and said, John, his name is John King, he says, John, to me, he says, JSB, how many students do you think we impact at the University of Michigan each year? And I said, well, John, I think last I checked, you have about 40,000 students coming in here. He said, yeah, we have 40,000 students, but we impact 250,000. I said, what? How do you get that, John? This seems like a little bit of romantic thinking on your part, since he has to justify cost. And he said, that's very simple. Every student that comes on this campus nowadays comes from different communities, and those communities they stay in contact with through their IM channels, through their iChats and SMS machines and so on and so forth, and Twitter and so on. And what's really happening is that these kind of communities, their own kind of social group stays intact to a large extent. Even if I'm at this campus, these other kids are some are back in their communities, some are at other schools, and so on and so forth. But they're forming through social networks a very powerful, personalized kind of learning media